Okay, so we are back for our second part of this series called the process of Psak, which is really an important part of our life, our identity as Jews. And this is going to be one of our favorites because it is where Machlokes comes from. Machlokes is something that is all very dear and near to us in the Jewish community, and so we're trying to appreciate this in fuller context. I'd like to start off by thanking Shelley Dorf and Mail who are sponsoring this morning's learning. Together as we mark just coming up the second yahrzeit of Mr. Ephraim Grimet of blessed memory, Ephraim ben Yaakov David Olav Shalom, whose presence in our shul was a significant and positive contribution to our community. So many times he was always with us in shul, always such a positive force, and so many of us knew him from before as well, and really appreciated him and his family in our shul. Let his memory always be a blessing, Be'ezras Hashem, and he should be a melitz yosha for the mishpacha here, for all those who are here in this space. It should be with continued blessing, Be'ezras Hashem, and he should have an aliyas neshama. What we're going to try to address this morning are a number of questions, some basic questions. There's so much to talk about. There's so much to learn. Let's try to do it together, Be'ezras Hashem. And so we'll start off with a few questions, and that is like, why are the rabbis always arguing? So another question we could ask is how can we say that we have common practice if we have so much dispute? This is like a question sometimes you hear people are struggling with faith. They say like everything in Judaism is a dispute. Like how do we know what we're going to do? How do we know anything is right if everything seems to be a machlokes? So sometimes we will also say where did it all start? Like what was the first machlokes? Why is machlokes continuing? Why didn't they resolve it? And are there any positive aspects of machlokes besides the jokes? So that's we have to try and look at some of these ideas. There's so much to talk about. Let's start at the very beginning. So we want to start off just to frame it with a quotation that Rav Kook said in his book called Shmona Kvatzim, lesser known of his books. It's just such a beautiful idea to frame our learning today. And he says the following. He says, "B'inyanei hadeot v'ha'emunot," in the realm of belief and faith. Which are based on ethereal and conceptual ideas. When you live in the realm of ideas, then you're going to have argument. You find two people who may be completely from one extreme to the other, different from one another, and really, in a deeper look, you'll realize they're actually saying the same thing. You find an argument which is burning till the seat of heaven. And the reason of machlokes is simply in language, is in linguistics. It's external, it's not internal. So whenever we deal with machlokes, Rav Kook sort of will call it wholesome look and spiritual, we'll call it broad look, is that we're really just quibbling about details. If we really understood each other, we wouldn't be arguing. Let that be a framework, and that's the way he dealt with people. That's the way he diffused situations, is because he didn't take it too seriously. He didn't get caught in externalities or divisions, rather internalities of the integration. That's where it was. So the story goes, it was like one of these days, these complicated days in the Jewish calendar. And let's say it's Erev Pesach Sheni, one of these days, and it's one of these communities in Eastern Europe, and they come to the discussion about Tachnun. So half the community says we don't say Tachnun. We never ever said Tachnun. This is not the way to do things. And half the community says we do say Tachnun. And they start having a machlokes. Now, in these things, I always smile to myself because the amount of time it takes to have the dispute, and then to talk about why the rabbi doesn't know what he's talking about and how we did it last year, and then after shul to continue, is way longer than the 15 seconds it would have taken to say tachanun or not to say tachanun in the first place. But nonetheless, it's a matter of principle, of course. And so what happens is that the communities are getting to this great dispute. We always said tachanun, we never said tachanun. They come over to the rabbi, they say, Rabbi, he says, so the one group says, Rabbi, is it our minhag to do tachanun? And the rabbi says it's not. So the other group says, is it our minhag not to do tachanun? He says, it's not. He says, what is our minhag? He says, do you have a machlokes? And sometimes that's just the way it is. So let's try to dig it back a little bit into. So every year the same thing happened. So where does it come from? So it turns out the first time we talk about dispute in general goes all the way back to Ma'aseh Bereshis. In fact, if you look at the 7 days of creation, all the 7 days of creation, thank you so much, all the 7 days of creation have a appellation, a description which says Ki Tov. It was good, except for day number 2. Why day number 2? Day number 2, says the Medrash, is because that was the day where there was division. Division between what? Between the upper waters and the lower waters, and therefore when there's division, it's not Ki Tov, it's not good. It's not 100% good. And the Medrash goes on so far to say, if this is a necessary division, and it's not Ki Tov, then unnecessary division, that's definitely not Ki Tov, that's not good as well. It's also worthwhile noting it's on day 2, where you move from a unit to expansion, right? So the idea of moving from singularity to expansion, that is the place where machlokes, where division comes to be found. It's interesting to note, just as a fascinating observation, there is division on day 1 too. Did you notice that? Right? So there's division between light and dark, but that doesn't warrant the removal of Ki Tov. You know why? Because they're different and it's necessary. It's obvious there's a difference between light and dark. When it comes to water and water, not so obvious. Maybe a different phase, right? This one's gas, this one's liquid, but it's not so obvious as to why they're so different. That kind of dispute over there, that warrants a lack of Ki Tov. And sometimes, so many times in our arguments are not black and white. They're not light and dark. They're water and water. They might just be different phases. So it's worthwhile thinking about where the removal of Ki Tov belongs. That's how far back it goes. It's almost as if what the Midrash is trying to tell us is somehow embedded into the very nature of creation is division. And that's really what the Gemara says. The Gemara says that is true about human beings. Why? Because it says, the Midrash describes, Keshem she'ein partzufeihem doimos zu lazu. Just as people's faces are not similar, look at the contours of a face. And I'm sure we've all had that person that they say, oh, we're just an immediate lookalike, and then we find that person and we're not like them at all, right? We look completely different. Well, if that's true externally, then in emotional makeup, we're certainly different to people, and therefore we are going to have very different opinions to issues. And I would actually say, if you go back to Rav Kook's observation, because the nation of Israel is a nation which lives in the realms of ideas, right? We don't live by the sword. We don't establish empires. We live in the book. We live in the realm of ideas, and the more you live in the realm of ideas, the more there is difference in the ideas that we have. We're sophisticated. We've got sensitivities. We're a complex people, and because we live in that realm, that's why there's so many differences of opinion. So much so that these are all famous things. But the Mishnah tells us in Pirkei Avos that Eizi Machlokes Shishi L'Shem Shemayim. Well, Kol Machlokes Shishi L'Shem Shemayim. The Mishnah tells us Sofel Iskayim. Kol Machlokes She'en L'Shem Shemayim Ein Sofel Iskayim. So that there are types of Machlokes which are good and types which are not good. The ones which are for the sake of heaven, ones which are not for the sake of heaven. What's the Machlokes? L'Shem Shemayim. So by the way, it should be noted that L'Shem Shemayim clearly is a reference to day 2 of creation. Right? That should be obvious to us when the Mishnah is talking about that. That's when the first Machlokes happened. But that's clearly a subtext, but just worthwhile knowing that the Mishnah is not just using this phrase as a throwaway. But what's the Machlokes Shi L'Shem Shemayim? So it says Hillel and Shammai. We have to think about what that means, because Hillel and Shammai are going to be critical players when it comes to Machlokes. But the Machlokes Shi and L'Shem Shemayim is Korach v'Hadassah. You notice, by the way, the interesting thing about that Machlokes is that there's no second side to the argument. Did you notice that? Right, Moshe isn't in. It should be Moshe and Korach, right? But Moshe wasn't engaged. It was Korach and his folks. It could have been, as the Chasam Sofer says in this Mishnah, that when you have a Machlokes, which is Shlai L'Shem Shemayim, all the folks on the one side actually are arguing with each other. They just have a common ill, right? So they have a rebellion. So they don't even have unity in terms of themselves. There's a lot to talk about here. I'd like to just close this little piece over here with Rabbi Yehuda Ami tells the Rosh Hashiva Gush's observation, where he says that whenever people are arguing and they say it's a matter of principle, then that machlokes is never going to end. Because they're going to say, I'm arguing for L'Shem Shemayim. I'm arguing, this is not about me. This is about the principle. And then when you argue about the principle, that machlokes never ends. It's going to go on for many, many, many generations if you're arguing based on principle. That's we'll call it the opposite of what the Mishnah is saying. Yes.
The phrase Shemayim is a contraction of A Shumayim. So again, the two dimensions.
Beautiful.
So that fits
the opposites.
As well, right?
Very good.
And yet they got to coexist.
Beautiful. Exactly. So this is a little bit of an introduction to arguments in general, and so I would say that argument itself is not something that we invented. I think it's a state of being of a human being. Is the fact that we see things differently. I always marvel. Marriage itself is quite an amazing thing. Here you take people who really have grown up with different cultures, perspectives, backgrounds, emotional makeups, parents, environments, and you put them together, and somehow they're going to try to figure things out. It's a miracle every single time. I mean, how much work needs to go into the fact that people can work together and operate on such a level, multiple tiers of partnership, financial partnership, emotional partnership, physical partnership, there's so much going on. And people manage to work together. That's a pretty significant miracle because there's so much different. There's so much difference between people, and it takes a lot of work. And so the same is true about all human beings. Is that we are simply different, and therefore we're going to argue. So they say, okay, so how do we govern societies? Like, how does Torah work exactly? Especially considering that God gave us the Torah. A certain part of the Torah we have the capacity to manipulate or to change or to develop, as we talked about last week in terms of the development of Torah Sheba'al Peh. And if that's the case, then you're essentially giving an argumentative creature, right, the ability to argue about these ideas. But these ideas are very significant because they affect our day-to-day practice. So how does that work precisely? There needs to be a system, and the answer is there is a system. And there was a system. In fact, when we look at dispute, we have to look at it in two completely different phases of Jewish history. The first phase of Jewish history, in fact, there was very little dispute in action. What does that mean in action? That means to say that there was very little dispute as to what the practice was. Why? So the Rambam explains, and this is so critical to our understanding of Judaism, especially those who think that everything's a Machlokes, because it isn't. The Rambam says in the beginning of Hilchos Mamrim, and it's worthwhile learning and appreciating this observation. He says, "Kashaya based in Hagadol Kayam." When there was the great Beis Din, the upper court, the Supreme Court essentially, which was the Sanhedrin HaGadol, which operated in the Beis Hamikdash, there was no dispute. What does that mean? Ela kol din shenolad bo safek le'echad mi Yisrael. So how would it work? Let's say you live in the Upper Galilee, right? And you don't know what to do in a certain circumstance. So what do? Shoel leBeis Din shebe'iroi im yadu amruloi im lav harei ze shoel im oisai Beis Din. So let's say that he goes to his local Beis Din of how many people would probably be in that Beis Din? 3, right? So the local Beis Din in the Upper Galilee, let's say, he went to the Netofa Beis Din, right? So and they say if they looked in the books, if there was an answer, they would tell him. If not, they would say, well, we need to consult. So they would send an emissary, they would send an email to Jerusalem. So there was 3 Batei Dinim in Yerushalayim. There was one by Har HaBayis, there was one by the entrance of the Beis Hamikdash. These were smaller, each one of 3. If not, then let's say the hardest questions, the Supreme Court cases, right, the real defining vehicle cases which are going to affect the future of all law in Israel, they would come to the Supreme Court, to the Sanhedrin, with a shal, and they would ask, if this is part of the Torah Sheba'al Peh, which was a tradition or a development, right? The Rambam is referring to those 2 different silos of Torah Sheba'al Peh, then they would answer if it was known. Im lav, im loy haya hadar kain borur etzel Beis Din hagadol b'danin boy v'sha'aton v'noisin b'davar ad sheyiskemu kulan. They would discuss this matter until there was consensus, or yamdu leminyan, or they'd have to go to a vote. V'yelchu achar harov, and they would follow the majority opinion. V'yamru lekol ha'sholim kach halacha v'holchin lahem, and that's how halacha was decided. So therefore, there could have been a dispute in court, but there was no dispute after court. Because once the court gave a ruling, that was the ruling, and that decision was rendered for all of the umbrella Batei Dinim across the land of Israel. So therefore, in a future situation which matched this case, they would apply the din which was there. Which means to say, all the dispute that we're talking about in the Gemara and the Mishnah is post based in Hagadol. So for sake of intellectual clarity then, so that means to say that for the time of the first Beis Hamikdash and the second Beis Hamikdash, the vast majority of the second Beis Hamikdash, there was no dispute between as to the major practices. There may have been sectarianism, so there may have been split off groups from we'll call mainstream traditional Judaism, as there was at the end of the second Beis Hamikdash. So there were all kinds of different factions, but in terms of the Purushim, in terms of traditional Judaism, there was no dispute as to what the practice was. It wasn't that there was even a lechatchila and b'diavad. Right? Where did the terms lechatchila and b'diavad even come from? That is a later day application of a dispute, essentially, right? So when you have two valid opinions, it's important to know that they are valid opinions of equal standing, and there's a dispute and the dispute remains unresolved, then sometimes in halacha that turns into lechatchila and b'diavad, which is a sort of grey zone. You should really be doing A, and if you don't do A, you can rely on B. That means to say there was a dispute, right? That it's usually based on a dispute, which is where lechatchila and b'diavad. There was no lechatchila and b'diavad in the times of Beis Hamikdash. It was you do this, and that's it. Because it was voted on. Every dispute was had in court, not in the streets, not at the Shabbos table, and it was voted upon, and that became the halacha. In a certain sense today, I find it interesting, is to a large degree, it's interesting to look at Chabad, because Chabad is very monolithic about its psak, because they only really have one stream of psak, the Shulchan Aruch Harav, and so when it comes to that, there's no disputes that you find sort of in the Mishnah Berurah with all kinds of complexities and so on. It's very sort of monolithic, and that's it, and there's only one way or the highway. That kind of thing, but even to a larger degree, was the way it was, and that's why like sort of all Chabad do the same thing, right? There's all just the same course of action. In Klal Yisrael, that's how it used to be for everything. Everything was one course of action in terms of this because of the base of Gadol. So when we talk about dispute, we're talking about dispute post Sanhedrin Gadol, which means to say in the last 2,000 years. That sounds like a long time, but you have to realize that for 1,000 years before that, there was less dispute in terms of practice. There was certainly dispute and argument about political sovereignty. So, as an example, in the first Beis Hamikdash, the kingdom split into two. Right? So that was a dispute. That wasn't a dispute about practice. That was a political, so to speak, egotistical expansion of a grab for power. But within the Judean kingdom, it was very clear as to what should have been done at times. There were sometimes disputes between the king and the Navi. And it's worthwhile looking at some of those interesting disputes over there, but usually there was a way of resolving those, not for now. Okay, so that's in terms of how dispute was resolved at those times. So you say, okay, so then when did Machlokes, as we see it, because you can barely get through any folio, any daf of the Gemara without a Machlokes. So if that's all post-based in Agadol, so what was the first Machlokes that we can record? And the answer is actually it's recorded very clearly in the Mishnah, the first Machlokes that was preserved. Meaning, Machlokes is endemic. We all argue. But Machlokes in terms of normative practice that was preserved and not voted on, which is the earliest one we can add to point a finger to? Anybody familiar? Good. Excellent, Paul. So the first argument has to relate to smicha. Not smicha as we call it, as we today in terms of rabbinic tradition, but smicha when it comes to a korban. The Machlokes is, and take a look at this very beautiful Mishnah. It passes us by, but you don't realize the significance of this Mishnah in source 5. The Mishnah says that Yosei ben Yoezer in Chagiga, the second parak, second Mishnah, Yosei ben Yoezer Amer Shalal Lismach, Yosei ben Yochanan Amer Lismach, Yosha ben Prachi Amer Shalal Lismach, Nitar Abeli Amer Lismach, Yehuda ben Tabai Amer Shalal Lismach, Shimon ben Shadach Amer Shalal Lismach, Shmai ben Amer Lismach, Atalion Amer Shalal Lismach, Hillel Menachem lo nechlakus, so Hillel Menachem never argued, Yotze Menachem nichnas Shammai, so apparently Menachem disappeared, in enters Shammai, and Shammai Amer Shalal Lismach, and the argument continued. Why are these 10 or 11 people so significant? Why are those names significant to us in this Mishnah? So these are not Tanaim. These are not the sages of the Mishnah. These are protos Tanaim. What does that mean? These are what we call, if you read the first parak of Perikei Avos, Zugos. Right? This is when there was centralized Torah leadership in Israel before the Mishnah, the leaders of the Mishnah. This is all pre-destruction of the Beis Hamikdash. These were the leaders of the times. Didn't really know what their titles were. Each of these groups of two. The one was the Nasi, who was sitting in the presidium. He was the president, and the other one was the Av Beis Din, the head of the Beis Din. They were the two leaders of the community. And this was maintained for 5 generations. For 5 generations, the centralized leadership was to the Nasi and the Av Beis Din, and we read them in Perikei Avos who the names were. There's Yosei and Yosei, right? Those are the first 2. Then there was Yosha ben Prachia and Nitzar Beli. Then there's Yehuda ben Tabai and Shimon ben Shadach, Shemaiah of Avtalion, and Hillel and Shammai. There were only 10 leaders throughout the course of these centuries, because it went from Av Beis Din to Av Beis Din, Nasi to Nasi, all the way down. Here's an interesting thing, which essentially the Mishnah is telling us, is there was a Machlokes which was intergenerational at the time of the Sanhedrin. There was a Sanhedrin active over here, and therefore it should have been voted on. It should have been voted on, but it wasn't voted on, and they maintained this Machlokes. Isn't that fascinating? This is the first Machlokes that was preserved and not voted down. Yes?
It's just a question, even pre that, right, we have Moadim, as a Machlokes.
Good question, yes.
And there are probably others that whatever, but even pre, that wasn't settled until much, it probably was preserved over time and then was only settled at a certain period of time. So is that included at all in this?
No, so Abi is asking a good question. We do see elements of dispute before. And so, as an example, David HaMelech's lineage was a matter of dispute. So Doeg HaAdami felt that David HaMelech was not fit to enjoy the kahal because of his matrilineal descent. And then it was the Gemara tells us that it was settled, and David HaMelech became David HaMelech. So I think those kind of things may be maybe an expression of a question of Misara, question of tradition, and that was very settled very quickly. So it wasn't a dispute about how we derive or how we expand this rule. It was what's actually the truth in this case, and that was settled very clearly in the base measure at that time. So I think those are more right based on Shmuel. So but the point is that there was I think it was because of miscommunication or an ego and miscommunication in the case of Doeg HaAdami, which was later clarified, as opposed to two sages arguing about the idea as well. Yes, Yossi.
So I have a question on the whole concept. We're talking about trying to figure out what God's will is, and the decision is based on human beings having an argument and deciding who's in the robe and who's not in the robe, and that is God's will.
It's such a very good question. I think this is the most humbling divine act is HaKadosh Baruch Hu's willingness to give over the keys to the Torah to human beings. It's the most humbling thing that HaKadosh Baruch Hu did. It reflects even the creation of the human being. Where, as Rashi quotes, he asks the Malachei Hasharis about the creation of human beings. Why does Hashem need permission from the Malachei Hasharis? He created them. And yet, in this incredible, sweep of humility, he gives over the keys to human beings who are going to quibble, who are going to argue, who are going to deride, who are going to misunderstand, who are going to shepherd each other, and ultimately he gave the rules of how to resolve that as well. Achar Rabim Nahatos is a divine command, so he wrote that in the Torah, trying to be able to steward us in the right direction. Right, and so one has to question mistakes, which we'll do next time, God willing. The realm of authority is how do we deal with mistakes in this. But if you think about that from HaKadosh Baruch Hu's perspective, it's the most remarkable. He made us a shareholder in the posterity of his Ratzon. That's unbelievable, which means to say that throughout the course of history, he trusted us enough with the responsibility of us to make intellectually honest decisions in situations. Sometimes we make mistakes. But to get to that, that's, by the way, why that whole Machlokes, Rabbi Eliezer and the Chachamim and Achrei Rabim Nahatos, Rabbi Eliezer may have been right intellectually and corrected from, we'll call it objective perspective, but at the end of the day, that's not the way the rules that Hashem gave us to interact with halacha. So you have to see the Tana Shel Achnai situation. This to me, your question to me is just the most, I would say, earth-shattering idea of how HaKadosh Baruch Hu trusts us in this relationship. But let's dig this a little bit deeper over here, because we have this moment of so to speak voting, where everything is voted in and there's one system. And then afterwards we see this expansion of dispute which is unresolved. But there's one dispute which is already preserved all the way through. Why is it preserved all the way through? This is an important thing to be aware of. Many of the later Svarim talk about this. The Mishnah's Eretz Yisrael and this Mishnah says a very interesting thing. I think the thing is a beautiful observation. Is that there's two values at stake. The dispute is about whether you do smicha on Yom Tov. That means to say you bring a korban to the Beis Hamikdash. Smicha is when the owner places their hands and says whether it's a korban which a person needs vidui on, that would be a sin offering, or it might not be. It might be a shlamim, it might be a korban ru'iyah. Other korban is brought to the Beis Hamikdash, and the owner would place their hands on this korban before it was shechted. And in a certain sense, the dispute over here in this Mishnah is as to whether a korban tzibur, that means a communal offering, requires smicha or not. And from the ideological perspective, the argument is such, is how much of a role do we as regular proletariats have in the communal offerings? The Kohanim did everything, right? And the power of the Kohanim was something which became more and more complicated and dangerous as the second Beis Hamikdash proceeded, because they took too much power. They took kingship and priesthood, right, under the Chashmonaim, right, Yochanan Hyrcanus, and that was a very complicated time in the second Beis Hamikdash. And this dispute, which was happening at the same time, was essentially arguing is how much does an individual have the rights in a sacrifice itself. Is a korban simul, do we have hands in that? Do we have a place in that? Or is it completely devoid of us and the Kohanim do everything? And it was such a significant, we'll call ideological battle, that they didn't even vote on this. In fact, the Margolios Hayom argues that the Nasi was not a voting party in the Sanhedrin, but he had veto power. Think about that, what that means for a moment. You think what that means. Is that brilliant to think what this means? So why was the Machlokes preserved? Because the Nasi and the Avbeis were in an argument. He couldn't vote, but he disputed ideologically, and so it never came to the table. It was sort of the two arms of wings of halachic development, which were essentially in check with each other, keeping each other in check, and ideologically each side deserved to remain in stasis.
What did they do for 2,000 years?
That's a great question. Exactly. I guess it depended who was in charge. That's the question. Is how does normative practice relate to a dispute? And you see this numerous times as well. Afterwards, there'll be disputes as to what did the tzitz say? What did they do? Right, is a question. So there's so many machlokes like this. But let's take this a little further. So the question is why did machlokes develop to the point that they stopped voting? Why did they not just clarify everything and make it monolithic? And there's one system of practice, and there's no black and white and grays. Why did that happen? So there's four arguments as to there's many, but there's four possibilities as to why this can be. The first is based on the Tosefta, is that when the Sanhedrin ceased to operate, that's of course when Machlokes happened, because there was no voting and there was no centralized authority which said this is the way Machlokes should be. So therefore it started burgeoning in such a way that every town had to make their own decisions. And as every town started making their own decisions, disputes arose, and great sages of different areas would dispute certain things. So you start seeing this in the 1st century, the 2nd century Common Era. You start seeing practices developing in different towns which were different. As an example, Rabbi Eliezer de Mila. Rabbi Eliezer felt that based on his halachic principles, that machshire mila doichen es Shabbos, that you could cut down the wood to make the fire, to melt the metal, to make the knife, to do bris milah on Shabbos, because milah is doichen Shabbos. Now the majority of the Chachamim didn't agree on this. We were just talking about this beforehand. So what happened in the city of Rabbi Eliezer? That's where they did what he practiced, but that so to speak got phased out. But there was no centralized voting authority that voted on this specifically. So it became more complicated. So the first thing was the recession of the Beis Din HaGadol. By the way, the Beis Din HaGadol was not stopped, it stopped itself. The Beis Din HaGadol, the Gemara tells us, stopped rendering decisions 40 years prior to the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash. Which means that, and why? The Gemara says, Mishirabu Roitzchen, there was so much murder going on in society that they stopped operating, which is counterintuitive. You say, no, so now they should operate, set up a satellite, right? Have the quick line, the easy pass, and they didn't. Because they were not simply to keep society into check, they were trying to render God's ratzon in society, and they felt that in a situation where anarchy was developing, they were no longer going to be necessary, which is fascinating. So they removed themselves. Yes?
So there are certain concepts that should, you would think, would be pretty basic. For example, tefillin. People were wearing tefillin since Matan Torah.
Yep.
And then all of a sudden, 1,000 years ago, there's an argument about what the tefillin are. And what the order of departure are. What were people doing for 2,000 years? Such
a good question. Rashi Rabbeinu Tam, what is happening with these? There has to have been a practice. It's a very good question, and I don't fully appreciate the answer, but there are many questions like this. Most, just to clarify this, and this is where it becomes so to speak, broad strokes. People say everything's a dispute. No. Everything that's written in the tefillin is clear. The shape of the tefillin, the color of the tefillin, everything is clarified. One little detail is of dispute. What actually happened is a matter of great discussion, and I don't know the full answer. But the one basic reason over here is that the Beis Din HaGadol said, okay, we're taking a step backwards, and then dispute expanded. Another option is that the Gemara in Sota tells us that it was because the words that it uses is Mishirabu Mekable Matanos. No, that's not the right one over here. Mishirabu Zechuche Halev Rabu Machlokes. When the boastful hearts proliferated, that's when dispute increased. Mishirabu Talmidei Shammai v'Hillel Shaloi Shimshu Kol Tzarchon Rabu Machlokes b'Yisrael. When the students weren't doing the necessary shimush, they weren't listening properly 100%, that's when Machlokes developed. At the times of Hillel and Shammai, which was the end of the Zugos, which is when the Sanhedrin was disappearing, that was the end of the second Beis Hamikdash. So students, that's when, meaning to say, it was a infidelity in the intellectual progress of the students, which led to Machlokes, because there was no longer, so to speak, this willingness to work together was limited. It's interesting because isn't that interesting that the last time the Mishnah in Avos says that it was a Machlokes L'Shem Shamayim was Hillel and Shammai, not Talmidei Hillel and Shammai. What the Mishnah is essentially doing is putting a limit on when Machlokes L'Shem Shamayim ended. That's essentially what the Mishnah is trying to say, just based on this Gemara. Third possibility is it could be in Naksuri, like you mentioned last week, is once they wrote down the Torah Shabal Peh, that's when there was this great amount of Machlokes, because once you write it down, you lose, you sacrifice so much. Yes, there's a great amount of sacrifice necessary when you write it down, because there's going to be misinterpretation. There's going to be differences of perspective just by the fact you write it down. And finally, in the introduction of Rav Levin to Rav Shirira Gaon, he argues that it is because of mistakes which crept in, because of tradition, because of what was happening in exile. At this critical moment in exile, there was a lot of problems happening, and people, without them, so to speak, mistakes in tradition happened to the point that there was dispute as to what was going on. So various different reasons as to why we start seeing the problems emerging, not problems, but machlokes in general proliferating. It is worthwhile, yeah?
Doesn't that answer Yossi's question?
To a certain degree, yeah, but one would like to think there's more than that, which we'll come back to. Because you're right, we could relegate it to that. But it's interesting to note that in general, since the time of the Sanhedrin Agadol, there seems to be a pattern in Jewish history, which is a pattern that I would call consolidation and expansion of Torah thought. What does that mean? There's moments in time where individuals or groups of individuals got together and said, we need to consolidate all the dispute and division and write down a corpus of material which will be for all of Israel. So who's the first one who did that? That is a watershed moment. Rabbi Yehuda Nasi was the author of the Mishnah, who essentially says we need all of these disputes being had across different countries now, as we're about to go into further exile, to be closed. Who's the next watershed moment of, so to speak, consolidation after expansion? Ravina and Rav Ashi, around the year 500, where they're closing the Gemara. The closing of the Gemara itself is a fascinating discussion. Read Rabbi Dr. Bergman's doctoral thesis. Fascinating discussion in general about the closing of the Gemara. And then when was the next real watershed moment of, we'll call it consolidation of lots of disputes? The Rambam. The Rambam in Mishnah Torah writes, and listen to his language in source 10. He says, "Vizman hazeh," in source 10, "Shetokfu tzaros yaseros." There are so many persecutions. Remember, the Rambam fled as a teenager from Spain under, at that point in time, a very fanatic fundamentalist Muslim group. Later on it was going to be the fundamentalist Christians, but at this point it was the fundamentalist Muslims. And he fled to North Africa, then to Israel, and then to Egypt. Right, so he wrote under the run. He says at the time, there's so much pressure now, and the wisdom of our sages is actively being lost. All the response and all the leadership of the Geonim, which is a 600-year period from the times of the closing of the Gemara until the time that the Rambam is living, about how they led the communities in Babylon, Iraq, and Israel, is disappearing. Nobody really understands or has access to them. And to study the Gemara, you need a lot of work. It's not so easy. Going to the next paragraph, he says, because there's no arti chotsni ani Moshe beribi Maimon Asfaradi. I Rabbi Moshe, the son of Maimon of Spain. V'nishanti alatzur baruchu ubinosi b'chol ele asorim. I researched all of these books for you. It says v'reisi lechaber dvarim amisbararim mikol elu achiburim b'inyana asur v'amuta v'atomei atahari im shadinei Torah kulam b'loshon berura v'derech kitzara. I now put it all together into 14 books into the new halachic system. By the way, he got very highly criticized for doing this because he changed the methodology of teaching. But what essentially he was doing is he was consolidating. Why? What stimulated him to do this? Is he felt that things were being lost. The expansion was too far. In Nisparda Chavila, the falcon can no longer hear the falconer. This is all falling apart, says the Rambam. I'm going to put it together. And again, one more critical time in Jewish history where consolidation happens, and that is the Shulchan Aruch, where the Shulchan Aruch and the Ramah pulled together essentially all of halacha into one place, and then of course it expanded afterwards, the Nosei Kalim and all the Machlokes and so on and so forth, and expanded outwards. But if you think about Jewish history as a pattern, we'll call it post-Sanhedrin world, essentially the pattern would look like expansion, consolidation, expansion, consolidation, expansion, consolidation. That seems to be it. And what is the stimulating principle? What brings about a consolidation moment? Seems to be takvu hatzaros, preservation. Is where there seems to be this drive to create a monolithic idea. Hang on for a second. Let's drive this a little further. Okay? So you say, okay. So let's just dig a little bit deeper into Machlokes. So historically speaking, this is at least Chazal speaking, why it is that this is happening. So you say, well, let's sort of hone in on Machlokes itself. Is there anything positive, or is it simply a miscommunication of the ages? So I remember when I once read, If Not Now, When, by Primo Levi. Anybody had a chance to read any of Primo Levi's books? Yes? Fantastic, good. I find them personally pretty depressing. He's just a very hard look at reality. And one of his books, If Not Now, When, is actually focusing on partisans, and they're in the forest, and this odd group of folks who sort of come together. And one night around the absent campfire, they're busy talking about philosophy, and they start talking about the Gemara, the Talmud. And this is the description of one of them to the other. And I always remember this as such a misguided description of Talmud. So I wanted to use it as our foil for a moment. So here's the description. He says, Pavel interrupted. I'll explain what the Talmud is to you with an example. Now listen carefully. Two chimney sweeps fall down the flue of a chimney. One comes out covered with soot, the other one comes out clean. Which of the two goes to wash himself? Suspecting a trap, Piotr looked around as if seeking help. Then he plucked up the courage and answered, the one who's dirty goes to wash. Wrong, said Pavel. The one who's dirty sees the other man's face, and it's clean, so he thinks it's clean too. Instead, the clean one with soot sees the soot on the other one's face, believes he is dirty himself, and goes to wash. You understand? I understand. That makes sense. But wait, I haven't finished the example. Now I'll ask you a second question. Two chimney sweeps fall into a second time in the same flue. And again, one is dirty and the other one isn't. Which one goes to wash? I don't understand. The clean one goes to wash. Wrong, says Pavel mercilessly. When the washed one, after the first fall, the clean man saw that the water in his basin didn't get dirty, and the dirty man realized why the clean man had gone to wash. So this time the dirty man chimney sweep went and washed. Piotr listened to this, and with the mouth open, half in fright and half in curiosity. And now the third question. The pair falls down the flue a third time. Which of the two goes to wash? For now the dirty one will go to wash. Wrong again. Did you ever hear of two men falling down the same flue, and one remaining clean and the other one dirty? That's what the Talmud is like. Right? So that's sort of this, the disconnected, uneducated Jew who had obviously clearly had, one bad encounter with Talmud in his cheder, and then went off to the workforce and is no longer, that's the sort of that perspective. And they're just it's all senselessness. So like what's really going on when it comes to dispute? So it is so much more than this misguided perspective, and this is the perspective you sort of hear this type of language. You hear this type of perspective on dispute all the time when it comes to, we'll call the world outside that looks in on us. So the Gemara actually describes this and relates in a very frank and intellectually honest way to argument. It's based on a pasuk in Koheles. The pasuk is at the very end when Koheles is coming to his crescendo. He says, "Divrei chachamim kadar vanois." The sayings of the wise are like goads, and we're not going to focus on that part right now, maybe next week. Like nails fixing in prodding sticks, given by one shepherd. The people in gatherings which were given by one shepherd. So the Gemara says the following. It asks it says the following observation in Chagiga Gimel Beis. That sages or people, and it's a meritocracy, everybody can do this. We all get together, we try to study together, try to understand what's going on. And you have different opinions as to what to do in a given situation. So the Gemara asks the question that we all ask, which is, Shema Yomar Adam, Hayakani Lamed Torah Me'atad. Why am I learning? It's all a dispute. Says the Gemara, Talmud Laimar Kulam Nitnu Miroy Echad. The pasuk concludes they were all given from one shepherd. Kel Echad Nasnam, Parnos Echad Amaram, Mipi Adon Kol Hamazim Baruchu, Vaydaber Elokim Es Kol Advarim Ha'ele. That all these matters were given. So the dispute, in a certain sense, what the Gemara is saying is a contradictory idea, which is what? That all the matters of dispute were given from God. You're also coming back to your point. So, but I don't understand. There's two people sitting around a table here. They come up with an opposite conclusion. This one says Tameh, this one says Tahar. You say, how am I supposed to learn Torah? The Gemara is saying that really they meroyai echad. They come from one shepherd. But it can't be. God can't, it has to be binary. The action has to be black or white. It can't be, this quantum principle of standing at the same time on two levels. This is what the Gemara ultimately says in Eruvin Daf Yud Gimel, is what's called the notion of Eilu ve'elu divrei Elokim Chayim. These and these are the words of the living God, which is a hard concept to understand. What does that mean? Surely truth is objective, and if truth is objective, that means to say it's mutually exclusive to other opinions. You don't have the right to a postmodern narrative in the face of truth. Right? So and today everybody has a truth, right? Everybody's entitled to an opinion, right? If you're looking at the news right now, it's equally as plausible. It sounds like that, these black Hebrews supplanted the Jews, right? That's just not true. That's objectively incorrect. It's not a narrative. It's not. You don't have that opinion. It doesn't exist. So how could it be that the Torah is saying that when you see a dispute, somehow it all comes back to Hashem? This is the question. There's obviously something bigger in dispute than simply miscommunications after the post Migdash, post Sanhedrin era. If it's all right, I just want to just do a little bit of further because of the timing. So there are a number of suggestions as to what this could mean. Two, which I think are incredibly meaningful. One is the Ritva. The Ritva, who's one of the medieval commentators, the Rishonim on the Gemara itself, says Elu v'direi Elokim Chayim in source 15. Shalu Rabbonet Tzarfas, Efshar Shiyu Shneim Divrei Elokim Chayim, V'zeh Ozer V'matir. How could it be? It's opposites. V'tirtzu, ki kisha'ala Moshe la'maram l'kabel Torah, when Moshe Rabbeinu ascended Har Sinai, Heru lo yas kol hadavar v'davar mimtes panim le'isur mimtes panim le'heter, v'shal HaKadosh Baruch Hu al zeh. So Hashem displayed in every concept 49 perspectives of heter, 49 perspectives of isur, and he asked Hashem v'amar she'ezeh masur l'chachmei Yisrael sheb'chol davar davar yachra k'moisam. So in the complexity of real issues, not monolithic issues, real issues, there are multiple sides on the right side, multiple sides on the left side, and he gave it to the Chachmei HaMasorah to find and to emphasize and to unpack them. Which means, if you think about what he's essentially saying, it's a very beautiful concept, is that when you have a dispute about a particular given issue, then essentially both sides are actually really reflecting a certain facet of a complex issue. Right, so the famous example that's used for this is, it goes back to various different traditions, but it's very helpful in this, is about four people who are, who don't come from Asia or Africa, and they're brought into the room with this new creature called an elephant, but they're blindfolded. And they're asked to give a description of what this creature is, and the four people walk out this room afterwards, and they give a pat down, and the first one says, "An elephant is clearly like a tree," and the other one says, "An elephant is like a brick wall," and the other one says, "The elephant is like a rope," and the other one says, "The elephant is like a hose pipe." So it says, well, what did these guys go in the same room? The answer is yes. The one was holding the leg, the one was patting the stomach, the one was holding the tail, and the other one was holding the trunk. So are they wrong? The answer is they're all right, but they're right about different parts of the truth that they're relating to. And that's the same over here, what the Rifah says. At Har Sinai, Hashem gave exceptionally complex, multifaceted ideas. And over the time of history, over the course of history, in a real, intellectually honest debate, multiple facets would be expressed. It's important for us to, if we had this idea in politics today, can you imagine? There'd be real discussion. On a lot of the issues that are policy that we're voting on today, they're not black and white, red or blue. They're complex. There's multiple, you have to have normative practice, but the issues are complex. It's not so simple that it's always right and always wrong. And that's what's being said over here, is that there was a divine will for us to unpack those. So therefore, in the process of debate is the expression of those separate ideas as well. That's what Rav Kook says in his letters. He talks about this expansion of completion, which is to be found when people come together in trying to find this. Another perspective on this, and I think this is a very beautiful idea, is actually the Torah Tamimah. The Torah Tamimah says it's not about this we'll call divine idea being revealed in a complex way. He says that if you look at source 17, he says Nira Kavana. What does it mean? If you have something which comes simply from one person, then it's not going to be that person, it's not going to be 100% true. Why? Because he might make a mistake. Something which has been tried and tested in peer review is much more significant than something which is simply the product of one brilliant individual. And I remember when I had my bar mitzvah, so my bar mitzvah was Parshas Chukas, and so I was trained with my bar mitzvah teacher, of course knew it all over heart. It comes the next year, and guess what? It was Parshas Chukas Balak. And so, of course, fearless 14-year-old gets up there and says, of course I'll do that. So into the first Aliyah of Balak, at a certain point, the Rabbi of Marshall, who was based in South Africa, Rabbi Kurtztag, who was 6 foot something, and he gets up and he made an announcement. And he says, I'm going to be the only one to correct him right now. That's how bad it was. Why? Because when you train by yourself, you train your mistakes inward. If you don't have an auditor, you train and you keep repeating and learning your same mistakes. No matter how brilliant you may be, if you don't have an external audit, you're going to learn your mistakes. And that's what the Torah Member says. Why is Elu ve'elu divrei Elokim Chaim? Is because it allows the ideas to be tried and tested by multiple different and complex minds who will fight, argue, and hammer out until we get to the refined product. Therefore, that's what it is. It's not about each of them having a specific truth as much as it is it's the peer test, the peer review of the whole experience as well. That is what the Torah Member says. So you say, okay, this all may be very nice in terms of the process of Machlokes and the development and the necessary development, the humbling development of halacha, as you described it. But at the end of the day, so what do we do? So in a post-Migdash reality, in a post-Sanhedrin reality, which is almost synonymous, not 100% because of the timing, but in a post-Sanhedrin reality, so what precisely do we do about this? So there are rules, which we'll discuss, God willing, next week in terms of this, but there is an important overarching principle, and with this we'll conclude. And that is, says the Maharal in Be'er Hagolah, he says in the bottom of page 6, source 18, where he says, by the underline, she'af im hadavar tomei, efshar shelo yeh tzad bechina el tahora shelma. Even if something seems to be completely impure, there must be something in it which is pure as well. V'chein im hadavar tahor, efshar shelo yeh b'loi bechina ma shel tumah, u'bnei adam mechulakim b'seichel, v'efshar sheyu kol echad bnei adam al derech echad. It can't be that everybody agrees. In fact, that's just the nature of it. To the next paragraph, rak. The Indian halacha, the Maaseh, when you want to know what to do, ein sofik sha'echad yoser ikar min hasheni. When it comes to halacha, we have to say that we have to give weight to one opinion over the other opinion. Right? Kama se Hashem, af im hadavar hu murkav, even if it's a complex matter. Mikol mokom ein ze kamoy zeh. Rak ha'echad yoser ikar kulam nitnu min Hashem yisparach. Rak yim echad mehem yoser ikar. So the Maharal says it may be true that there are multiple facets, but in the end of the day, we need normative practice. And therefore, we have to have a way of resolving this. And so therefore, there what's called klalei apsak through the ages. In the times of the Mishnah, it's Rabbi Akiva mechaveroi, not mechaverov. Right? There's the rules as to which sages we'll go in which direction. And in the Gemara, there are the rules. And in the post-Gemara, there are rules as to how we resolve disputes. And it goes all the way through how the Shulchan Aruch phrases his yesh omrims. Is a default and then yesh omrim, or yesh omrim and then a default to yesh omrims. There are rules as to what's called klalei apsak, how we get to this. Which means to say that we have to live in this tension of knowing that there could be truth to both opinions, but there has to be one way to act. Right? And there's rules as how to do that. Rabbi Nahatos was in the times of the Sanhedrin, and there's more complexity when it comes to the post-Sanhedrin rule. Rav Shechter points out, and he has a beautiful article on Elu ve'elu, where he says that we have to be careful with this, you see, because we aren't the experts necessarily all the time to know the difference between those two. Sometimes what we do is we give too much credence. Somebody once said to me, I did research on the internet, and there was a rabbi who looked rabbinic enough to have an opinion, and so it seems like it wasn't a problem to do X, so we did it. And I'm like, I don't know if that's the way I would break Yom Tov necessarily myself. But what Rav Shechter points out is that not all opinions necessarily even warranted to be in this space, which means that you don't say Elu ve'elu divrei Elokim Chaim to things that were voted down and excluded from the Masorah, as an example. So Rav Shechter points out here He says this concept does not always apply in cases. Rashi and Tosfos talk about where, let's say, a idea is against a predominant idea in the Gemara or against a pasuk. That is not an opinion. That opinion becomes voted out, and it doesn't exist as an opinion to even be a yesh alma lismach opinion as well. In Rav Shechter, in fact, talks about an example where just this last week, actually, Rav Shechter was in town with Rav Amar at the end of the Smichas Chaveh program, and somebody asked a very pointed question. They said, Rav Shechter, in so many of your Piska Corona, during Corona, when you gave so much guidance to the community, you relied on a principle which was called Shasa Dechak Kebedievedami, that in a time of difficulty, we treat it like a Bedieved, and you can rely on a opinion you wouldn't usually rely on. But yet, when it came to making minyanim on porches, do you remember this? There was a time just before this Shavuos where it was illegal to have 10 people together, but people saying, well, let's make minyanim on different porches or properties, right? And Rav Shechter very clearly came out against it. In fact, well, I was there when I was involved in bringing the Rabbanim of the community together to ask these very complicated questions. And Rav Shechter says you cannot do that because there's a problem of is there tziruf between different houses and with streets and the distance between properties here in suburbia. And so he says, but why didn't you rely on the Rashba? The Rashba says you can, as long as you can see. That's sufficient. You know what Rav Shechter said? He says, because the Rashba was voted out of halacha. If you read the Rishonim, all of the Rishonim treat the Rashba as neglected on the side of history. So us, as a proletariat, we can research and find the Rashba. But the Rav Shechter says that Rashba did not make it into mainstream halacha as being even a part of the Elu ve'elu, as part of the halachic process. But that's why we have to ask somebody who has that capacity to know what makes it and what doesn't make it. And Rosh Hashanah wasn't saying this because he was responding to what was happening in Corona. It's because that's the precise way that halacha works. It's really important to know this. And that's why somebody on the outside, probably somebody unschooled perhaps, might miss this, which is why we need to have the intellectual honesty to ask this. I'd like to conclude with the following teaching and then and story. And this is the observation that Rav Kook makes. Rav Kook quotes the pasuk, which is based on the Gemara expands. Kol bonayich limudei Hashem v'rav shalom bonayich. Rabbi Elazar says, Talmidei Chachamim maribim shalom ba'olam, that the sages brings the peace to the world. And you say to yourself, really, peace? They're arguing all the time. Every 2 minutes, every daf of Gemara, they're arguing. That's not really peaceful. That's a lot of dispute. So Rav Kook says that we're reading the word incorrectly. Shalom doesn't mean to say kumbaya, we're all around the campfire and we're all singing together. He says that shalom means a notion of shleimus. Shleimus means that when you have complex issues, if it's only monolithic, then there's no way to arrive at real shleimus. Shleimus is when multiple people are giving multiple angles at the same issue. Then you come to the more complex and real outcome of what an issue is. Most real values in our life are intention. There's no such thing as only one right way when it comes to complex issues. And therefore he says it's not Gadol Shalom Banayich, it's Rav Shalom Banayich. When there's multiple perspectives, that's when you arrive at truth. The respect to know, first of all, you have to be qualified to have an opinion. But those who are qualified to have an opinion, when they sit around the table and they render opinions, all those disputing opinions help give us the more holistic perspective of what that is. So Machlokes not just as a historical outcome of a miscommunication, but as perhaps the process that Hashem allowed us through to try to develop ideas to the greater being. It's worthwhile knowing how far this goes. When the Ger Rebbe started buying land in Israel, he saw what was happening in Europe, and he felt that it was time to buy in Israel. This was very criticized at the time, because remember aligning oneself with the Zionists and secular Zionists was seen so much so that the Neturei Karta burnt an effigy of the Ger Rebbe at the time. So ad kedei kach. And then when they reported this to the Ger Rebbe laughed, and he says that if they had not burnt an effigy of himself, he would have organized a group to have done it. What does he mean? So it comes down to and I'll close with the story because we're now out of time. But the story is about a king who has a very precious treasure, and he decides that he's going to put it into a place where it could be impenetrable. So what does he do? He places it in the recesses of one of his strongest fortresses, which happens to be embedded in a deep and dark forest along the side of his kingdom. But he gets the best and the finest of all his military and police experts who are going to be manning this. So he takes all the best of all the divisions and he places them on the ramparts of this castle, and he has them guard it. But it turns out that in this forest, from time immemorial have been a band of thieves, and these band of thieves are highwaymen who rob anybody who passes through the forest. And they hear about the fact that the king's treasure has been placed in this palace. So what do? So that they spend a few months just listening. They just do surveillance. So they see when the change of guards happen. They see who's in charge where. Are there any weaknesses? Are there any access points? And what happens is that one night under surveillance, they hear from the ramparts that the guards are shouting at each other. It's the middle of the night, and there's this great argument that's going on. And this one's shouting, this one's accusing, this one's defending, and it's turning into a ruckus. And they say, this is it. This is our moment. So the thieves take the weakest point that they found. They make access to the castle, and as they enter over the ramparts, all the guards swoop down in a unified mission and capture them and arrest them. And the head of the highwayman turns to his guard as he's being pulled off in chains to the cell, and he says, I don't understand. We heard you were arguing. He says, yeah, you're right. We were arguing, but the reason why we were shouting at each other was so not to fall asleep in the dark of night in the middle of the forest. Because it's very hard to maintain your place on a post all night with your night vision goggles and look into the forest for the enemy, which is never going to really appear very easily. And so we are shouting at each other to keep awake. And that's what the Gerer Rebbe was really saying. The Gerer Rebbe was saying is, I'm doing something which seems a bit bold in my time, as I need to have a fringe group which is going to be burning my effigy in order for me to remain in the fold. And the same thing with Chassidus. Chassidus had so many great values, but it was very dangerous. Suddenly all kinds of things, Zmanei Tefillah, out the window, right? All kinds of things, suddenly everything, new rules. And Misnagdim says, what are you talking about? That's not Judaism, right? There's Shulchan Aruch, right? And thank goodness for the Misnagdim who kept the Hasidim in check. And thank goodness for the Hasidim who said, wake up and start thinking and feeling again. And what about the unschooled, the people who are not the academic brilliant, and their relationship to Judaism? And every dispute you see throughout history, certainly there's casualties. But the disputes keep us awake to allow us to hold together, to band together, to arrive at the truth at the end of history. That is the perspective with which perhaps we can see it in a more holistic perspective, despite the fact that when we're in the weeds, it becomes harder to appreciate. So Rabbi say, I know it's the end of a very long hour, but Be'ezras Hashem, next week we're going to get into the realm of authority. How are the dominions of authority? How do we pass the halacha? Thank you so much for your time.